video, we're going to be discussing the history of Project Sign, the first official U.S. military investigation into UFOs that concluded they were interplanetary vehicles in 1948. This was the beginning of the official UFO cover-up. Why is it significant to look at Project Sign and understand it? Most people are aware of Project Blue Book that came later, but Project Sign is the first time the U.S. military and the government looked at the UFO phenomena officially and studied it and tried to come to some type of conclusion. And we can look at this as kind of like the first honest and, quote, innocent effort of the military to investigate UFOs. So it's got that pureness to it almost, where it's almost as if the military did not really know exactly how this was going to be handled officially. And by looking at this, we can kind of see and read between the lines and understand what went down. What went down back in 1947 into 1948. The second bullet point, to understand we must get to the root in any topic of anything, and especially in history. We really have to get to the root origin and the starting point as much as we can to really understand how things develop there and out. So by understanding the root, we understand the whole subject, the whole phenomenon on a much deeper level and in its historical context. And the last bullet point, yes, what we realize here is that this Project Sign and what happens after becomes the origin of the UFO cover-up, the official UFO cover-up. So if you look at Project Sign and look at what is said out there from standard trustworthy websites, it's not going to give you the full story. And what I've underlined here on the top here in Encyclopedia Britannica, it says this was a investigation and most of the scientists concluded that they were most likely sophisticated Soviet aircraft. And actually we'll find out that that was ruled out very quickly at the very beginning of Project Sign. So already this is, quote, misinformation from your Encyclopedia Britannica. Go down to the National Archives mention of it on the bottom there, and they say of the 243 reported sightings, the results were inconclusive. We're actually going to find out that that was false too, and that these scientists, after looking at 300 plus reports and spending 9 months, concluded that some of them had to be interplanetary vehicles, as they put it. So this is just to show us we can't really trust even these reliable, authoritative sources out there to tell us the truth about these subjects and events. We actually can look at primary sources now and put the picture together for ourselves. So that leads me to, what are my sources for this information that I'm going to be sharing with you? This is of the utmost importance. I want you to research it yourself. I don't want you to take my word for it. I'm just simply presenting to you my research, looking at the primary source documents and conveying the information we can glean from it. So first, we actually have Project Sign's technical report in 1949. So I've used that to draw some information out, even though we'll find out later this was like a sanitized version of the original report. Also drawing from a great work here by Dr. Bruce Maccabee, who was a 36-year optical physicist in the Naval Research Lab. And he also had worked with people in the CIA, and they had been investigating UFO files together for a while. Now, what Maccabee did that's fascinating is he was the first researcher to obtain the FBI's cache of UFO documents. And as he says in the book, he put the FOIA request out there after the FOIA law was initiated in the 1970s, and he asked the FBI for its UFO documents, expecting to get nothing, because the FBI always said that they never dealt with the issue, and he was surprised that he received a lot of documents. So in this book, it actually gives us a lot of insight into what was happening in the military, in the Air Force, in 1947-48, when things started to go a certain way and Project Sign was developed. So we actually can look at these primary source FBI memos and documents to paint this picture. And here's another source that we're going to be drawing from. This is from Captain Edward J. Ruppelt's book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. Now, Ruppelt was the first director of the more well-known Project Blue Book that was an outgrowth of Project Sign, Project Grudge, and then Project Blue Book. And he resigned, feeling that it wasn't an actual honest scientific investigation into UFOs. So he was out of there by 53. He writes this book in 56, and he tells us a lot about what happened with Project Sign, because when he took over Project Blue Book, he got all the Project Sign files, and it was his job to look back at these cases, look back at what Project Sign had done, and move it forward. So he tells us a lot of information about Project Sign that actually we wouldn't have been able to get elsewhere. And in the last bullet point, Ruppelt died of a heart attack 4 years later at the age of 37. So I always find that interesting. Of course, could just be natural and no foul play there, but you do have to wonder a little bit. And lastly, our last source here is a scholarly article called Project Sign and the Estimate of the Situation. This is from Michael D. Swords of Western Michigan University, and he helps us round out this study here by drawing from a number of primary source documents that actually are hard to obtain, and so we get even more depth into this. So putting all this together, I'm going to be presenting to you what we can take away from what happened with Project Sign and how does that increase and expand our knowledge about the UFO subject. And really, I spent a lot of time reading all these documents, so I'm trying to condense this down for you here and pulling out the key points. All right, before we get into Project Sign, to really understand it all, we have to look at the historical context. So first and foremost, if you're relatively new to the UFO subject or just exploring it, and maybe you are a long-time researcher and have a long-time interest in this, then you'll know that UFOs go back much further. It's not like they started coming in the 1940s and 1947 in Roswell and then it was a thing. There's actually a lot of data showing that it goes back a lot further and even into ancient times, although that data is, of course, the hardest for us to really corroborate and really substantiate, but we do have a lot of references going back. And some of my favorite images, this one here from a cylinder seal from the Sumerian civilization, and you can see up there in the top, kind of looks like a spaceship. But we don't need to go that far back to see that UFOs were in the skies before the 1940s. We can look at something called the airships of 1897. Very interesting topic. I encourage you to research it on your own. You have hundreds of witnesses throughout the country. And what's interesting about this time is there was no airplanes to confuse people at this time. The air technology was almost non-existent back then. So these sightings have a certain significance in that way. And on my third bullet point here, credit to Linda Zimmerman for this piece of information. Thomas Edison actually had to release an official statement saying that these mysterious airships everyone was seeing in the sky were not some secret experiment of his. So interesting, just a little data point here to remind us that 1947 is not the beginning of UFO sightings. But things do happen, and there is a surge and an increase happening. And so let's look at UFOs becoming a thing in this critical period between 1945 and 1948. We have the Foo Fighters of World War II, 1945. You had many reports by Ally and Axis powers, pilots, and personnel of the Foo Fighters, which were these usually seen as glowing lights, but flying up next to the airplanes. And when they would go next to the airplanes would kind of glitch out and drop down in elevation. It would mess with their components. This was reported again and again, and it was officially investigated by the U.S. military. A military officer by the name of Doolittle went over there and investigated this, so we know that something was happening here, for sure. There's enough to corroborate that. Also, following up that, in 1946, we had the Swedish ghost rockets. Same thing. Many credible witnesses, military personnel, documentation showing that the U.S. military was very, very concerned about these Swedish ghost rockets. So we see there was already activity before 47. But then we do have the famous point, which is usually seen as the starting point of the UFO wave in the United States. And this is Kenneth Arnold's June 1947 sighting. He was a pilot flying over Mount Rainier in Washington, and he saw 9 disc-shaped craft flying in formation. And in fact, the way he described them flying were as if they were saucers skipping. And that's where the terminology flying saucer got its popularity from. Now, shortly after, only a matter of weeks after Arnold has his sightings, which he reported to the Air Force, by the way, and they were in the files of Project Sign, you have the infamous Roswell crash of July 8th, 1947. Now, analyzing the Roswell case is a whole separate subject that you could spend hours talking about. But for our purposes here, we need to understand that something crashed in the desert. It was very controversial. This newspaper headline you see here was actually printed, and then the next day it was recanted. And there's been a lot of mystery surrounding this. We still can't definitively prove it 100% with conclusive physical evidence that something unexplainable or some type of advanced aircraft crashed in the desert and the U.S. government retrieved it, and even bodies. We still can't definitively prove it, but if you go down that rabbit hole enough, you see that there's enough information there to walk away with it saying, okay, something definitely happened there. And hopefully in the coming years, maybe we'll get some information and facts about what really happened with Roswell. But then just a couple weeks after Roswell, we have a crucial turning point in U.S. history, really, especially with the military and the government. The National Security Act, July 26, 1947. This is when the Department of Defense is created. It puts all the military branches under one roof in the Pentagon. The U.S. Air Force is created. So it separates the Army Air Force that was part of the Army. Now it's its own separate thing, the U.S. Air Force. The CIA comes into official existence. And then the NSC, National Security Council, and then the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So you have this whole military apparatus coming into place at the same time that UFO activity is ramping up. Reported crashes and reported crash retrievals are ramping up, and they're all dealing with it in their own way. So it's kind of a critical point here. Now, the documents show us that by July 30th, at least in 1947, the government, the military, starts to officially, on paper, take UFOs seriously. And this is evidenced by Lieutenant Colonel George D. Garrett. And he puts out something called the Garrett Estimate. So he's tasked with, hey, look into these reports, look into all this, what's going on. He gathers 16 cases, 16 military reports from throughout the country of sightings of the UFOs. And in the bullet points here on the bottom, you can see who were these people. Well, 4 Air Force captains, 2 Air Force majors, 1 Air Force lieutenant, 6 pilots, and 4 civilian air patrol personnel, which at the time that was an organization that had a very important, serious role towards working with the military as a civilian group for monitoring the skies. So you have all these people giving their reports, and literally they were seeing these flying discs perform these incredible feats. We'll look at it in a moment here, actually. So Garrett gets this report together. He puts it out there to the military. He puts it out there to the intelligence community at the time. And in what the FBI documents show us, actually, is that this guy, Garrett, who had these 16 cases, he started talking to the FBI. He's like, I want to try to figure out what's going on here. Now, this is a really key part of this that gives us a real insight into the phenomenon. So this is real important. I want to pay attention here. So Garrett's talking to this FBI guy, and he says, it was Garrett who, on August 19th, told the FBI liaison, Special Agent Reynolds, that whereas the high brass of the War Department had exerted tremendous pressure on Air Force intelligence to determine the cause of sightings of unidentified flying objects flying over Sweden in the summer of 1946, in this case, saucers over America, the, quote, high brass appeared to be totally unconcerned. So just to pause for a second, the 1946 ghost rockets, this guy Garrett was saying, hey, the War Department was crazy about this. They were really concerned. And now we have them in our own skies, and it looks like they don't even care. So he's sitting there doing his job as an intelligence officer, and he's saying, this just doesn't make sense. Let's continue here. Garrett said that many of the witnesses were, quote, trained observers, reliable members of the community, which to him meant that, quote, these individuals saw something. And then, thus, he had concluded that, quote, there were objects seen which somebody in the government knows all about. All right, and this is the key takeaway here. First guy officially in the intelligence community to investigate this goes, hey, this isn't adding up. The government, the higher levels of the military, actually already know about this. That's what I'm reading for this. And so that tells us that, yes, there were probably crash retrievals before. There was probably activity before. This was probably already being understood and kept at a top secret compartmentalized level before 1947. Nevertheless, George Garrett goes and puts out a memo. He says, I'm going to put this out there. I've analyzed this, and here are the details of the conclusions from these 16 highly credible and reliable reports. We have it underlined here. Section A, this flying saucer situation is not all imaginary or seeing too much in some natural phenomenon. Something is really flying around. B, goes back to that point in the earlier slide, lack of a topside inquiries, right? Meaning nobody at the top seems to care. And in the second part underlined here, this gives more than ordinary weight to the possibility that this is a domestic project about which the president, etc. know. So Garrett's thinking, it must be some top secret of ours that's just we don't know about unless you have a need to know. Going down, he says the surface appears to be metallic. On the last underlined point here under number 3, flat on the bottom and slightly domed on the top. There's your typical UFO classic saucer. We're going to see this language come back in a moment here when General Nathan Twining is confronted with this issue. All right, so Garrett puts this out, and it's sent over to the Air Force, and Nathan Twining, who was a 4-star general, and at the time, in September of 1947, he was the commanding general of Air Material Command. Now, Air Material Command in 1947 would have been the branch of the Air Force tasked with any type of air technology that the United States is aware of, knows about, is studying. They would have been the highest group in the government to handle such a situation. He's the commanding general of it. His team looks at Garrett's report, hands it over to Twining to review it, and we're going to see what Twining says about it. And as a final note here, this guy was no joke. He went on to become the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1957 to 1960. So he had quite a career after making the statements you're going to see him make in a minute. Being the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is essentially the highest level you could possibly get in the military, because you are the person conferring with the president and representing the other chiefs of staff of all the other branches of the military. So ultimately, you have the most authority. So Twining goes on to have this illustrious career. But look what he says about UFOs in 1947. On the bottom there, the check mark. This is just to show you, and you can pause it if you want in a second, all of the people that weighed in to help him come to this conclusion. People of the Institute of Technology, T2, Office Chief Engineering Develop, Aircraft, Power Plant, Propeller Laboratories, and Engineering Division, T3. So this wasn't just anybody. All these scientists, all these top people looked at this, and here's what they concluded. It is the opinion that the phenomenon reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious. B, there are objects probably approximately the shape of a disk of such appreciable size as to appear to be as large as man-made aircraft. The reported operating characteristics such as extreme rates of climb, maneuverability, and action which must be considered evasive when sighted or contacted. And these objects are controlled either manually, automatically, or remotely. So here you go. 1947, after all of this is our commanding general's assessment. And here he goes into more detail. The apparent common description is as follows: metallic or light reflecting, flat on the bottom and domed on top. Well-kept formation flights varying from 3 to 9 objects. Here's the other thing maybe we don't think about as much. These sightings, they were flying in formation. It wasn't really always just one-off flying saucer UFO here and there. A lot of times they were in formation. And of course, number 5 here, no associated sound. Yes, right, these are silent, which would have baffled these top air material command officers and personnel. How could these things be silent? Right? We've got jets, we've got the cutting edge technology, they're loud as can be. So just imagine being in that. And now number 3 here to close it off, Twining recommends. He says, hey, look, this is our assessment to the best that we can do, and therefore I'm asking for a detailed study of this matter to look at complete sets of all available and pertinent data. Twining puts it out there, and it's approved. Secretary of Defense approves it, and therefore Project Sign begins. Now, one thing to keep in mind is basically it branches into 2 sections. You have the Air Force intelligence at the Pentagon that starts to investigate it, but then the real investigation is going on at Air Technical Intelligence at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the infamous Wright-Patterson. And that's where Project Sign begins, at ATIC at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And yes, so Project Sign begins after Twining's memo, and here's how Ruppelt describes it in the second bullet point. This was a, quote, serious, secrecy-shrouded project that, quote, only the top people at ATIC were assigned to. And how he explains it in the third bullet point is that the question of these investigators at ATIC was not, do UFOs exist? It was given that they existed, and it was to find out if they were either Russian or interplanetary. So their first line of inquiry is, hey, you know what? We know that Russia inherited a lot of those secret German documents after the war, so maybe the Russians got their hands on some of that experimental aircrafts that the Germans were developing. So the aerodynamicists team at ATIC and Wright Field Aircraft Laboratory basically did some computations. Okay, what's the maximum performance that they would be able to get out of these German designs? And they realized even these German designs, they wouldn't have been able to do this. They even contacted the German engineers who wrote up these plans and showed them the reports, and the German engineers said there's no way. Okay? And so on to the third point here, they concluded it was not possible that the German designs could account for the sightings being reported. So they definitively rule that out. No, these are not Soviet saucers, technology that they got from recovered German craft. We've ruled that out. Okay, let's move along here. Are they any kind of humans? That's their next line of inquiry. So what they do is they have the Air Force Aeromedical Laboratory study this, and what they determine is that there's no way the human body could withstand the reported speeds and maneuvers of the saucers. So they rule that out. They say, you know what? In terms of our known human science, that the human just can't be inside of these things, so it can't be human. So their next logical step is maybe they're non-human. Maybe they're from outside of the planet. So Sign looks to outer space. And here's another quote from Ruppelt explaining this. Quote, ATIC began to change their thinking. They now began to eye outer space because only some unknown race within a highly developed state of technology could build such vehicles. And so this is how it's going. It's moving along here. Now, Project Sign began in January of 1948, so we're about 3 months in now, March 18th, 1948. There's a meeting, and this is a meeting with the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board, which has been implicated in all such sorts of other things in certain UFO research circles. But here we have from the FBI documents We have a transcript from a meeting between Colonel Howard McCoy. Now, McCoy was basically the top guy in Project Sign. He was the director of intelligence of Air Force's Air Materiel Command. So he was the point person for Project Sign. So he's talking to the scientific advisory board, and he's telling them about 3 months into Project Sign what's going on. And here's what he says here in the underlined sections. He says, "This can't be laughed off. We have over 300 reports, which haven't been publicized in the papers, from very competent personnel." He says they're practically all Air Force, airline people with broad experience. We're running down every report. And then in the blue, "I can't even tell you how much we would give to have one of those crash in an area so that we could recover whatever they are." Little did he know, or maybe he did know, and that's what Maccabee speculates on, who looks at this document and then offers his analysis. Did McCoy know there were actually secret crash retrievals, or perhaps more likely that was just a whole other level of secrecy going on, and he was kind of just honestly managing this project and was curious about it? But nevertheless, we can see here they were already 300 reports in 3 months, and it was serious. It was not being like, these are just people who don't know what they're talking about. And so what happens, as Ruppelt explains, is the Air Force begins its disinformation tactics from the beginning. First point here, Air Force officials disclaimed serious interest in UFOs, but every time that a newspaper went to interview a new witness at a sighting, Air Force intelligence agents had already been flown in, debriefed the witness, obtained sketches, and sent the data to Project Sign. And as he explains in the second point, quote, "Many people had supposedly been warned not to talk too much." The Air Force was mighty interested in hallucinations, so he's highlighting this point here that the Air Force was taking the official line that there's nothing to see here, but at the same time, they are flying Air Force intel officers to the sites of these sightings immediately, getting the data and getting out of there and getting it back to Project Sign. So we can see that something's going on here. Now, Project Sign's 3 months in, they're starting to collect all this data. There are some important cases to take note of here. And one is the Mantell Incident, January 8th, 1948. Project Sign starts in January, so they get coming in hot already. What happens is Mantell, this Air Force officer, is training with a couple other guys. They see a UFO, and Mantell goes and chases it. And basically, in the process of chasing it, he crashes and dies. And the official explanation that was given was that it was Venus, that it was the planet Venus. And this was debunked later, as Ruppelt explains it. Actually, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who had become the official astronomer of Project Blue Book and actually was the astronomer being consulted for Project Sign, he said there would have been no way it could have been Venus. And then the later further official explanation was that it was a skyhook balloon. So the other thing is there were towers in the same region that were reporting the UFO. So if you read Ruppelt's book, because Ruppelt took this case when he took over Project Blue Book, and he said, hey, I want to get to the bottom of this Mantell case. He went out, re-interviewed as much people as he could, and he basically came away with an inconclusive summary saying, I don't know, I guess it was probably a skyhook balloon, but I think that it was most likely a UFO. And as his partner said when interviewed by Ruppelt, he said there would be no way that he would have went up to that unsafe altitude and chased this thing if it wasn't something serious and significant, not just a skyhook balloon. So anyway, you can investigate that case on your own. The reason it was important is because it was putting this pressure on the Air Force to figure out what was going on. You have pilots dying chasing these things, right? And it's being publicized. Now, here's an interesting case. And you can pause and read this testimony yourself here, but I'm just going to highlight why this case is important. February 1948 in Norcatur, Kansas, you had 5 witnesses of a UFO exploding in the sky. And this farmer, Leland Salmons, who was very well respected, had a high status in the community, he gave this testimony. And basically, it's this bizarre UFO. It's got a pipe sticking out. It's only 4 feet long. It's kind of got like some type of fuses that are lighted, and it's moving in these erratic ways, and then it just explodes, and it's kind of bizarre. The point that's highlighted is that the Air Force didn't even go there and investigate the debris. It didn't investigate what happened, and so it sheds a little light on how much were they really pursuing this, or how much was some other apparatus in the military getting there first, and then Project Sign was just, we're good, stand down. The other point is, to me, I feel like this might be evidence of the early reverse engineering efforts of the secret branches of the military and the industrial private world, because maybe this would have been plenty of time. Let's say that these crashes started happening more in 1947. This would have been plenty of time for them to start experimenting. And to me, this sounds like something man-made. This doesn't sound like a non-human item. So interesting case. And one more that we'll look at here that I thought was interesting. And mind you, I read many, many pages of all of these, and some of these, I had to narrow it down to a few. And then you had in April 1948 at Holloman Air Force Base, there are these trained balloon observers at the Air Force Base, and they see UFOs. They see flying discs right there in plain sight. They see them. And so the sign team, because this was at an Air Force Base, from our best and brightest eyes out there, Project Sign goes right to the base. And they actually didn't even get to interview the witnesses because they weren't there. But they were able to talk to one of the commanders at the base, and he tells them that they had at least 3 previous sightings just like this one of flying discs. So here's the Air Force saying, wow, they've been seeing these things over our Air Force Base. This is 1948. And now, as a side note, Hynek is being brought in here to debunk these. J. Allen Hynek, he becomes the chief scientific advisor to Project Blue Book, and later in life came out and said, yeah, I literally was just hired to debunk all these UFO sightings. And he actually said it was fun for him to make up stuff and try to paint a picture that could explain it away. So there's some pretty wild ones, and you can look into that more. But here's the key point that happens, and one of the best sightings actually of this time period, July 1948, the Chiles-Whitted sighting. Now, these are 2 commercial airline pilots, and for one of the top airlines at the time, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but they're flying, and they see this, see in the picture there, the illustration, this rocket-shaped UFO almost hits them, but moves out of the way, kind of hovers around where they get a look at it, and then just takes off and is out of sight. But what's crazy about this sighting is that they saw windows, right? They 100% determined that they saw windows on this thing, and they go through the whole process, get debriefed. So now Project Sign is like, wow, something is going on here. They were almost waiting for something that would just put it over the edge of like, these are some type of really created craft and not just some wild atmospheric phenomena, even though they had tons of other credible reports. But this one kind of put it over the edge, especially because it was a near miss and putting pilots in danger, and especially also because it was corroborated by ground operators at a separate Air Force base who were in the same area in the flight trajectory of this rocket UFO, and they reported seeing the same type of object moving in the same sort of way. So Project Sign says, here it is. Here we go. Like, this is the last one to close it up. Plus, we got to give an estimate of the situation. We got to tell higher ups what we think, and so that they can take action, because now our pilots are in danger. So this leads them to make the top secret estimate of the situation. And here is what Ruppelt, who was one of the few people inside the military that got to actually see this estimate of the situation before it was destroyed permanently. He says it was a rather thick document with a black cover, and printed on the top were top secret. And he says it contained the Air Force's analysis of many of the incidents, and all of them had come from scientists, pilots, and other equally credible observers, and each one was a genuine unknown. So, seems like it's good, right? I mean, Project Sign spent 9 months investigating over 300 reports from the most credible people possible. And they give their detailed, thick report over to the top guy at that time, who was General Hoyt Vandenberg. He was the United States Air Force Chief of Staff at the time. And they say, hey, here's what we've concluded. At least some of these UFOs are interplanetary craft. Wow, right? This thing passes up the chain of command, by the way. It gets to several other generals, colonels that have to eventually pass it up to Vandenberg for the final approval. So this thing gets to Vandenberg's desk, and what does he do? No, rejects it. Vandenberg says, Ruppelt says he wouldn't buy the interplanetary vehicles. Conclusion. Vandenberg says there's a lack of evidence. He rejects it, sends it back down, and destroys the report. Right? And this is seen as a real turning point. Because in the underlying point here, and this is Bruce Maccabee analyzing this, he says, in rejecting the estimate, Vandenberg effectively set forth a non-science-based policy that UFOs or flying saucers could not be officially identified as extraterrestrial vehicles. Right, because you just had the top possible scientific team in the correct branch of the military try to figure out, hey, what's going on? Our Air Force captains and pilots and personnel and scientists are seeing these things. What's going on? And that's the conclusion they come to. Hey, look, they have to be another intelligence because of what they're doing, and we just don't have that. And Vandenberg rejects it. And therefore, this science-based approach is not acceptable anymore. And we're going to see the pattern that the Air Force carries out that leads into today. So, mind you, another additional detail that's important here is after Vandenberg shuts it down, they were so convinced after this 9-month study that they did that they went back to the Pentagon and argued and tried to convince Vandenberg that they were right. But Vandenberg didn't budge. Following that, they have a big meeting at the National Bureau of Standards with the Scientific Advisory Board, which some researchers have claimed that the Scientific Advisory Board was involved in a deeper level of a compartmentalized top secret reverse engineering crash retrieval operation. So that may be possible. But our takeaway from here is that after this, basically the Scientific Advisory Board was given the authority to look over these Project Sign reports, and anything that doesn't add up, take it out. You're going to kind of have the authority here. We can't trust these Project Sign scientists anymore with these interplanetary vehicles conclusions. So that's what happens, and they revise the report. They're not allowed to give their scientific conclusion. And after officially 243 domestic and 30 foreign incidents, officially 80% of these reports are unexplained. And you can pause and look at this graph here. You see on the left there, most were sphere and disc shaped, and then on the far right, most were undetermined. So 80% of these could not be explained, even with guys like Dr. Hynek coming in and doing everything under the book he could to, glue together an explanation. And was it 80% unexplained or was it 90%? Because here's the primary source report that I've drawn the red question mark on. Originally, it was typed approximately 10% have been identified, but somebody crossed that out and put 20. So Project Sign comes to an end. The party's over for these scientists. The leaders of Project Sign were so convinced and confident in their conclusion that they refused to change their interplanetary conclusion, and therefore they were purged from the official Air Force investigation into UFOs. They got rid of them. They were sent to other projects, or they were just ended up kind of being moved off of these projects. And the Air Force Intelligence and the Office of Naval Intelligence make their own estimate, kind of saying the same thing in December of 49. And then it becomes Project GRUDGE, which basically becomes a period of inactivity. And as it's described in the literature, it was kind of like a half-hearted operation. They would barely collect and just kind of do the bare minimum to say, hey, the Air Force is looking into this. So it seemed like it really was a cover story that then led into Project Blue Book. Now, this is Ruppelt's own reflection after studying all the Project Sign files. He says, people wondered if there was a reason for the change. Was it actually an attempt to go underground, to make the project more secretive, to cover up the fact that UFOs were proven to be interplanetary and that this should be withheld from the public? And in the second paragraph, he says, just as the reports were getting better, the skepticism went up. So to him, he smells something going on here. Now, here's the last thing the Air Force has to do. Time to tell the public something. So Colonel McCoy, who was in charge of Project Sign, he's given the task of, hey, what do we tell the press? And McCoy comes up with this formula here that carried on into modern times. Let's look at it here, right? A, discuss openly the explained sightings. B, formulate statements which make it appear to the American people that most sightings can be explained. C, suggest that continued investigations will uncover explanations for those sightings not yet explained. And D, do not discuss the unexplained sightings that we have highlighted in red there. In later years, one more element will be added to this information release format. E, state that the sightings which could not be explained simply had insufficient information for an explanation. Remind you of Arrow, remind you of Sean Kirkpatrick, it's the same formula. The ones that are unexplained, it's just because we don't have good enough data, right? So this has been going on. This is where they established it in 1949. But this is where we have an interesting twist that kind of sets the foundation of the paradigm for the last 75 years, all right? The press have been knocking at the Air Force's door for an answer because people are seeing these flying saucers. It's a real thing that people are experiencing. People want to know what's going on. So finally, after the Sanitized report comes out, the Air Force agrees to collaborate with one type of press and media contact, and that's someone named Sidney Chalet from the Saturday Evening Post. Now, from CIA documents declassified, we see that Sidney Chalet had a relationship with the CIA, so we can put that together. And they welcome him into the Air Force, and the documents actually show us that they wanted someone who was going to present it in a way to debunk it. We have the evidence to show that. So Chalet is directed to publish a story debunking and ridiculing serious study of the UFOs. And this comes out. It comes out in April 30th of 1949, and it kind of sets the tone for public opinion. Everybody in America is waiting. What do they know? What are they going to tell us about it? And Chalet comes out with this article ridiculing and debunking UFOs. This was the first press story that had actual U.S. Air Force sponsorship for it. And here are some quotes, calling it rich, full-blown screwiness. The Air Force was forced to investigate the reports reluctantly. However, we know by seeing the primary sources now that that was not the case. They were not forced to investigate it reluctantly. Twining was taking it very seriously. The teams at Air Material Command were taking it very seriously. So that was just a straight up lie. And the last thing they did is they quoted a lot of these top Air Force names that were known in the public, and they were basically quoted as just saying they're nothing to see here. So that was the official article that came out. But that wasn't going to do it, and a stroke of fate and luck on our side here comes through because the Air Force fumbles their public relations operation. They figured at the same time that the Chalet Post article comes out, we'll release our own official public report that will just provide the corroboration for that to put this whole thing to bed once and for all. And they released something called Project Saucer, which was really what Project Sign was. And it really ends up becoming more pro-UFO than Chalet's post piece. And here's how Professor Swords puts it in his article. The Pentagon's poor communications and blundering had produced the exact opposite effect from what they had seemingly intended. Chalet's article was the mainly debunking publication, and the Pentagon's release looked like a corrective in the pro-UFO. amazing unidentified technology direction. So in other words, the post is just a clear debunking, ridiculing UFOs, and then the Air Force's official public release is like, oh wait, there's actually something real here? So the good journalists of the time and investigators realize that this doesn't add up and there are unintended results. This actually makes more people convinced that there's something real going on that the government's trying to cover up. This was a mistake on their part. Anybody who was decent at being a journalist or just an independent researcher would see the inconsistency and say it's obvious. And so, this actually is what begins one of the early civilian research groups. Donald Kehoe is one of the people who realized this doesn't add up, and he got some collaboration from one of the popular magazines of the time, and he came out with an article shortly after this saying, hey, I've got sources, this is what they say, and this is why none of this adds up, none of the conclusions. And he begins a very serious UFO research group called NICAP, and that's a whole other story. Eventually, it seems that it got infiltrated by the CIA. He had CIA directors on the board of it. It became this whole other thing. That's a whole other subject. But basically, it begins this paradigm of the people either taking one of two options that were presented at this time. One, you believe the debunking, and you just don't think about it, and it's whatever, and it's science fiction, or you look at it and say, hey, something real is going on here, and the government's covering up. And then we have the last 70 years of UFO research that has done that task, and now here we are today. 2024. This is a clip from the unanimously passed bill in the Senate about non-human intelligence, biological evidence of non-human intelligence, materials of non-human technology. Okay? We're talking about 80 years later. Here we are. Well, at least we're here in one sense, in a positive sense. In the other sense, it's ridiculous that this has been going on for this long. It's time for us to get some truth and clarity on this subject. But hopefully, by understanding the real history of this, by studying it, by looking at the primary sources, we can see the deception that went on from the beginning and what actually happened. So in conclusion, first point, we have strong primary source evidence that the top levels of the military were already handling the UFO issue before 47. Okay, we have those memos. We have some nice evidence to show there was already a secret operation going on, or at least handling of this phenomenon. Second point, we gotta look at this for what it is. This was the first honest, high-level scientific investigation of UFOs by the Air Force, and they concluded that they were interplanetary vehicles. A whole team, 300 cases, scientists, 9 months. That's their conclusion, and it's rejected by one Air Force general because of his own opinion. This shouldn't have been allowed, but the way the system's set up, this is what happened. Could we imagine what would have happened if Vandenberg said, all right, and pushed it through? And then we just had a normal, open investigation and said, okay, all right, we have interplanetary craft here. Let's tell the public. They would have dealt with it in 1948. And then we could have moved on, and who knows what our world would be like now. But this was a junction, and it went that way, and we can see it there in the documentation. And the last point, this is the foundation of the relationship between UFO sightings and the official government stance is established, and this is what we've been living in for the last 75 years and all of its complexities and offshoots to this day. So, thank you for watching. Hope that you got some new information from this. I find it fascinating that this is what happened, and we can look at it and see it through the evidence. And hopefully we will see the scientists of Project Sign vindicated in the coming years, maybe this year, maybe in the coming months. I don't know. But thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.